What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk with Peter Burnett. In today's episode, I'm going to be going over the Week 10 action, and in anticipation of the first release of the College Football Playoff rankings, going to be going over my projection, or more so my opinion. If I was on the committee, I'm going to be going over my order of the teams and which teams I think will be just on the outside looking in. But before I get into that, if you're going to enjoy this video, please feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date whenever I upload. But the first order of business is obviously this last week's action, and it was finally a top 5 win again for Ryan Day. I think it's important to note that he had won a couple of top 5 games before that loss to Michigan in 2021. It had just been a long run without getting that top 5 win, but he gets it, and it's actually the first top 5 road win for Ohio State since 2006 when Jim Tressel did it. I'll have to see which game that was. I think it was at Texas, but I'll have to verify that. So it's been a long time. Not even Urban Meyer achieved that at Ohio State, winning a game against a top 5 opponent on the road. So the Buckeyes get that win. I think another takeaway from this game, I truly believe Ohio State has the best goal line defense in the country. Now, overall, I think Georgia still probably owns that distinction, but Ohio State on the goal line, I think few teams do it better. They had that late stop. Penn State had 4 plays inside of the Buckeyes 3-yard line. Now, the play calling there by Andy Kotelnicki, by James Franklin, was kind of questionable. Why don't you try to go to Tyler Warren, who had a phenomenal game, a record-setting game the week before? He didn't put up a ton of yards in this game. I think he had 47 on the ground and 47 receiving, but he didn't touch the ball there. He was their playmaker going into this game. No touches there for Tyler Warren. I think it's a case of Ohio State also stamping their top 3 ranking. I think Miami makes a case for that, but they still haven't really played or beaten a good team. Louisville's win over Clemson makes that win last week look a bit better for the Hurricanes, but I think Ohio State still, because their losses to the number 1 team, I think they deserve to be in that top 3. Another thing, the Ohio State offensive line stepped up. They've been maligned by injuries and by struggles last week against Nebraska, for example, but their offensive line stepped up big time, played a good game, and Donovan Jackson made a very interesting quote that maybe I'll just pop up on the screen here, or probably just do that, but an interesting quote from Donovan Jackson, the Ohio State offensive lineman. So I think the Buckeyes pass the test. They get back into that consideration of being a top 3 team, and maybe even in the discussion for that number 2 spot. More on that in a little bit. In other news in college football, it was one of those weeks where outside of this game, I didn't really expect much, but that was shaken up by big, really upset losses for Texas A&M, Clemson. Both of those 2 teams really got blown out, honestly. Louisville handed Clemson their second loss of the season, first in ACC play, and South Carolina. Shout out Shane Beamer and Beamer Ball in Columbia. It was a huge game for the Gamecocks. They dominated Texas A&M and give the Aggies their second loss. So both of those 2 teams now are probably going to have to win the conference, because if they don't, that means more than likely it's a third loss, because Texas A&M and Clemson are both still in favorable position to get to the conference title game, although Clemson will have to compete with SMU. More on the Mustangs probably in my next point. All 4 of those teams, again, are likely going to need a conference title. For Iowa State, it's their first loss of the season, so there may be a little bit more in if they win out and maybe miss out on the Big 12 championship game. They could still be in that consideration, but their first ranking on Tuesday will be huge to kind of dictate where they're going to be. Kansas State also lost close on the road at Houston, and I think also one other observation from these losses is it really clears the way for Boise State. I think the Broncos are now in a position where if BYU drops a game, they will be, and maybe even if BYU doesn't, just because the Big 12 is kind of as I expected, cannibalizing itself a little bit. Boise State could be a serious contender for not just being the highest ranked group of 5 team, but being one of the highest ranked conference champions. The 4 highest ones will obviously get that bye week and the automatic bid. So that is something that is looking really good for Boise State. And I think the Big 12, if you get either BYU losing in the conference championship game or losing before then, Boise State will jump the Cougars and be in that spot. So that's something interesting to watch. Mentioned SMU. They're setting up a potential date with Miami in the ACC Conference Championship game. They really dominated Pitt, comprehensive win for the Mustangs. Kevin Jennings, I think, had over 300 total yards and 3 touchdowns. And Clemson's loss paired with the Mustangs' win is big. The rest of the Mustangs' schedule, their opponents are combined 12-12. They're home against Boston College and then Cal to wrap up the season, and a road game at Virginia in between. So, yes, we've seen that teams can get upset, but their only loss is to BYU. If BYU winds up winning the Big 12, that'll boost their resume. SMU and Boise State are going to be neck and neck in these rankings. I think that's going to be really important to see where the committee goes with that. But again, I don't really see them beating Miami this year, but they're likely to get to that conference championship game because they're still undefeated in ACC play, and they don't have Miami or Clemson left on the regular season schedule. Couple of other things, Oregon, Georgia, and Miami all kind of pulled away. Those are all teams that are certainly top 5 teams. Georgia, I think, honestly, was very fortunate that DJ Lagway got injured. I am wishing nothing but the best for the talented freshman Florida quarterback. It's rough going for the Gators right now. I mean, they've had the toughest schedule in college football, and now they're down to the 3rd-string quarterback. So thankfully for them, the end of their schedule, because of how bad Florida State, for example, has been this year, is not as much of a murderer's row as it initially was, but they have a tough final stretch. Oregon kind of took care of business in the Big House. They pulled away pretty early in that one, and then Miami was actually down by 10, I think, at one point against Duke. They wind up winning by 22, so it's easy to forget that they trailed in that game. But the Blue Devils did a pretty good job in like the first half, and then Cam Ward did what he has done best this season and just leads his team in the second half. Not so much cardiac canes in this one, but still an impressive performance by Miami. A couple other teams that picked up a couple wins, while other teams, like the 4 teams I mentioned that got upset, were losing games. You've got Tennessee and Indiana both boosting their college football playoff chances just because their percentage, as these other teams in front of them or around them lose, they get the chance to kind of move up in the rankings. So another thing, this season, a little bit like 2007 with the chaos, not quite to that degree yet. That could change. Winning is the best thing that you can do. So both of those teams picking up wins, no matter how good or bad the opposition is. Kentucky for Tennessee and Michigan State on the road for Indiana. It's still big to get wins for 2 teams that I think will fall inside the top 10. So now, going straight into that, I'm not going to go over every team individually or conference by conference. I was thinking about doing that. Maybe I will later this week. I'm just going to get straight into it. My rankings, again, this is, if I was on the College Football Playoff Committee, this is how I would rank the teams. Number 1, I think, is Oregon. They have a win over a certainly top 4 team, a team that I think is top 3, debatedly top 2 in the rankings. They're number 1. They're the Big Ten champion in my projections. The way Ohio State looked this past Saturday, I can see them potentially getting a little bit of revenge in that one, but as of right now, this is more what I think the rankings will be, not so much my prediction for the rest of the season. Georgia right now, highest ranked SEC team. They've got a good win over Texas. Their loss, though, and the fact that they have a loss to Alabama, and this is where it kind of like in the rankings, I could see Ohio State being number 2, because talking about that loss, I think Ohio State's loss to number 1 Oregon is a lot better than Georgia's loss to what'll probably be probably top 12, maybe in like that as high as number 10, Alabama. So that's why I think Oregon is certainly number 1. And I think I'd probably put Ohio State at 2, but because they're behind Oregon in the conference standings, that puts Ohio State at 5. Miami, I think, is number 3. They're probably behind all 3 of those teams. I would probably rank them 4 in the overall rankings. And then you've got BYU just ahead of Boise State because they are undefeated. Their schedule hasn't been as good or as tough as any of these other teams have been, or even debatedly Boise State's, but they're still unblemished. They haven't lost a game yet. So I'm putting BYU there at 4. I'd probably have them a little bit lower down. I'd have them behind Texas, who I have at 6. I think the Longhorns, their only loss is to the number 2 team in the country, or number 3. Then I have Indiana. I think their resume is not overly impressive, but I do value their undefeated record over the team that I have next. I have Tennessee at number 8. Then I have Penn State at number 9. They have probably the third best loss out of these rankings, or debatedly the best one if we're putting, which I am, putting Ohio State ahead of Georgia. I think if you're ranking quality losses, which is tough to do, I think quality wins should have much more weight. But Ohio State lost to the number 1 team in my rankings. Texas lost to the number 2 team in my rankings, and then Penn State number 3 team. But they also have, I think, a better schedule than Penn State has. So that's kind of my explanation there. Penn State at 9, Boise State at number 10. I think I would have BYU like at number 10 in the overall, or at number 9 in the overall rankings. Boise State just behind them. But again, maybe even if Boise State wins out, I think if BYU wins out, they probably stay ahead of Boise State. And every week that SMU continues to win, the Cougars look better too. But I do have them moving very much closer to that top 4 conference champions position. At number 11, Notre Dame. The Texas A&M loss makes their win over them look a little less impressive. They have by far the worst loss out of anybody on here to Northern Illinois, but they do also only have 1 loss. And then coming in that 12 spot, I'm just penciling this one in as the winner of the Alabama-LSU game. I'll get in later this week into who I think will win that game when I do my preview for Week 11, but I have whoever wins that game, I think probably finishes with 2 losses. They're probably out of the SEC championship game unless Texas A&M slips up again, which they could, but it would be to Texas, so it would be Georgia-Texas again. So likely the winner of this game finishes with 2 losses. The loser has 3, and with how many teams are in contention right now, that means they're probably out. However, if one of these teams, like a Penn State, slips up again, or a Tennessee slips up again, any of those teams, it would open the door for one of those teams potentially to get in, but I think 2 losses still is better than 3. So those are my kind of observations, and then taking a look at teams that I think have a decent shot to get into the playoff, but would probably have to win their conference championship, or win out and maybe not go to the conference championship game. In some cases, that's better than going. Clemson, Pitt, and SMU out of the ACC. SMU is getting into that territory. I would have them right now as the first team out, just behind, again, that Alabama-LSU winner. I think 2 losses in the SEC is a little bit better than 1 loss for SMU. Even though it is a quality loss to BYU, I think Alabama's losses are slightly better. Vanderbilt, debatably so, but they are ranked. Big 12, Colorado. I think Iowa State now probably. I would probably have Iowa State just behind SMU. I think BYU is a much better opponent than Texas Tech, especially at home. So Iowa State is there behind him. And then Kansas State, they can still get to the Big 12 championship game if they beat Iowa State. I think Kansas State, out of all the teams on this list, are the only one that is exclusively win your conference championship and you're in the playoff. They cannot afford to lose another game the rest of the season, but they are still alive because of where they sit in the Big 12 standings with just 1 team that's undefeated. So then in the Big 10, it's Indiana. They're going to have to win out. They don't necessarily have to. Well, okay. scratch that. For Indiana, I think where I have them at number 7, they can afford to lose to Ohio State if it's close. That game is in Columbus. If they play tough, the issue for the Hoosiers is they won't have a ranked win. They're going to have to beat Michigan as well, but that looks more and more likely with every passing week. But I think Indiana can probably afford to lose one game. They're just in that fringe territory, though, where it's a little shaky just because of how weak their schedule is for them, which is unfortunate. And then in the SEC, again, teams that probably either have to win out or win their conference championship game. Now Texas A&M falls into that category. Before this week, I wouldn't have said that. I would have said they probably could afford to lose to Texas. That's no longer the case. Then LSU and Alabama. So that is my look. Again, quickly going through the rankings based on the format of what the bracket will look like, not necessarily in the order. Oregon number 1, Georgia number 2, though I would probably have them at 3 overall. Miami at 3, again down to 4. BYU at 4 as the 4th highest ranked conference champion, probably more around 9, 10 area. Ohio State at 5. I think they're probably the number 2 team right now. Texas at 6. I guess they would be 5. Indiana at 7, put them up at 6. Tennessee, the 8 seed, put them at 7. Penn State, the number 9 seed, 8th ranked. And then Boise State right behind BYU in the rankings. The Notre Dame, the Fighting Irish, and then the Alabama LSU winner. So that's my rundown of this week's action and also my opinion, I guess, on the college football playoff rankings, how I would rank these teams. But might be 2 separate videos, but if you stuck around to this point in the video, if this is one long one, thank you so much for taking the time to watch College Football Talk. I'm your host, Peter Burnett, signing out. Peace.